My name is Daniel Brooks, and for most of my life I believed that hard work could solve almost any problem. I was not born into wealth. Nobody handed me property or business opportunities. Everything I owned came from years of sacrifice, long workdays, and risks that most people were unwilling to take. More than 20 years ago, I purchased a small piece of land beside a beautiful lake. At the time, the property was nothing special. There was one aging cabin, a narrow gravel road, and a lot of overgrown trees. Most people looked at it and saw a burden. I looked at it and saw potential. I spent countless weekends repairing structures, clearing land, and improving the shoreline. Every dollar I earned went back into the property. There were years when I barely took vacations because every spare cent was invested into another improvement project. Slowly things began to change. One cabin became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became 8. Eventually the property grew into 12 beautiful lakeside cabins that attracted visitors from all over the region. Families came for summer vacations. Fishermen came during tournament season. Couples came for peaceful weekends away from busy cities. Many guests returned year after year. Some even considered the cabins their second home. Watching families create memories on that property became one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. The cabins provided income, but they also provided purpose. Every morning I would walk along the shoreline and feel proud of what had been built through patience and persistence. For many years life remained simple. The business operated smoothly. Guests were happy. The cabins stayed booked. The property continued increasing in value. I honestly believed the hardest years were behind me. Then the HOA arrived. The neighborhood surrounding the lake slowly changed as developers built expensive homes nearby. New residents moved in. Large houses appeared along the shoreline. Community amenities expanded. Eventually, a homeowners association was formed to manage the growing neighborhood. At first, I paid very little attention. The HOA did not control my property. My cabins existed before the community was developed. Everything seemed straightforward. Or at least it did in the beginning. Over time, I started noticing something unusual. Members of the HOA board seemed increasingly interested in my property. Questions were asked during community meetings. Comments were made about the cabins. Suggestions appeared regarding future development. Nothing was openly hostile, but the attention felt strange. The person leading most of those conversations was the HOA president, Linda Harrison. Linda had a reputation throughout the community. She liked control. She liked authority. And she rarely accepted disagreement. People often joke that Linda treated the HOA like a personal kingdom. At first I ignored it. I had no reason to worry. My property records were clear. My business was legitimate. And I was focused on serving guests, not arguing with neighborhood boards. Then one afternoon everything changed. I was repairing a dock near one of the cabins when a mail carrier arrived with a certified envelope. The moment I saw the envelope I felt uneasy. Certified letters rarely bring good news. I signed for it, opened the package, and began reading. The first paragraph confused me. The second paragraph shocked me. By the third paragraph I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The HOA claimed that my 12 cabins violated community regulations. According to the letter, they believed the property should fall under HOA oversight and control. I read the document again. Then again. Then a fourth time. The claims made no sense. My property existed long before the HOA. The cabins operated legally for years. Nothing about the situation justified their demands. Yet the letter was very real. The more I read, the angrier I became. Someone had spent significant time preparing that document. Someone honestly believed they could pressure me into surrendering authority over property I had spent decades building. That evening I spread every document across my office desk. Property records. Survey maps. Historical permits. Tax records. Anything connected to the cabins. I wanted to understand exactly what was happening. Hours passed. The sun disappeared. Night arrived. Yet I continued reviewing paperwork. The deeper I looked, the stranger the situation became. There was no obvious reason for the HOA's claims. No hidden violation. No overlooked restriction. Nothing. The entire situation felt wrong. The next morning I called several professional contacts. Surveyors. Property managers. Legal advisors. Everyone reacted the same way. Confusion. Nobody understood why the HOA believed it had authority over my cabins. That uncertainty bothered me. Because when people act irrationally, there is usually a reason. And I intended to discover it. Over the next several days, I started investigating. I visited county offices. I reviewed historical property records. I examined decades of documentation connected to the land. Most of the records confirmed what I already knew. The cabins belonged to me. The property boundaries were clear. Ownership history was well documented. Then something unexpected happened. While reviewing older files, I found references to an access road. At first, the information seemed unimportant. Every property has roads. Every development requires access. But as I continued reading, my curiosity grew. The records repeatedly mentioned a specific private roadway connecting the main highway to the lakeside area. I requested additional documents. More records arrived. Then more. And suddenly a completely different picture began emerging. The road was not owned by the county. It was not owned by the HOA. And it was not owned collectively by residents. According to the records, it belonged to a private individual. At first, I assumed the owner was some long-forgotten developer. But when I located the original deed, my heart nearly stopped. Because the name listed on the document was mine. For several seconds, I simply stared at the document. I checked the name again. Then I checked the property description. Then I checked the filing date. Everything matched. There was no mistake. There was no confusion. The private access road serving the entire lakeside community belonged to me. I leaned back in my chair and tried to process what I had just discovered. How could something this important have gone unnoticed for so many years? The answer became clearer as I continued reviewing the records. Decades earlier, the original property owner had developed several parcels around the lake. During that process, a private road was created to connect the future community to the main highway. When ownership changed over the years, various pieces of land were sold separately. But somehow the deed for the road remained attached to the property that eventually became my cabin business. The road ownership had never been transferred. It had never been challenged. And apparently nobody bothered to verify who actually controlled it, including the HOA. The realization completely changed how I viewed the situation. Just days earlier, I felt like someone defending himself against a powerful organization. Now I understood something important. The HOA's position was not nearly as strong as they believed. In fact, they had launched an attack without fully understanding the legal landscape surrounding their own community. I immediately contacted an experienced property attorney. The next afternoon, I sat across from him in his office while he reviewed every document I had collected. He spent nearly an hour studying the records. Occasionally, he would make notes. Sometimes he would compare maps. Several times he requested additional documents. Finally, he placed everything on the table and looked directly at me. The expression on his face told me everything before he even spoke. He was impressed. Not because of me, but because of what the documents revealed. He explained that ownership of a private access road can carry significant legal importance. Every resident entering the community used that road. Every contractor used that road. Every delivery service used that road. Emergency vehicles relied on that road. Without access, the community would face enormous challenges. Of course, that did not mean I could simply block people from reaching their homes. The law does not work that way. But it did mean I possessed leverage the HOA never expected. More importantly, it exposed a serious weakness in their position. My attorney recommended immediate verification. Even though the records appeared solid, he wanted professional confirmation. I agreed. The following week, surveyors arrived at the property. Modern equipment was unloaded from trucks. GPS devices were prepared. Historical maps were compared against current measurements. The process took several days. Throughout that time, I found myself growing increasingly curious about what they would discover. Part of me worried that the old records contained errors. Maybe there was some missing document. Maybe ownership had changed without being properly recorded. Maybe there was a detail we overlooked. But when the final survey report arrived, those concerns disappeared. The surveyors confirmed exactly what the deed stated. The access road belonged to me. Every major boundary matched historical records. The ownership chain was intact. The documentation was valid. And most importantly, the findings could withstand legal scrutiny. For the first time since receiving the HOA notice, I felt genuinely confident. Not because I wanted conflict. Not because I enjoyed winning. But because facts were finally replacing uncertainty. Meanwhile, the HOA continued operating as if nothing had changed. Additional letters arrived. More demands appeared. The tone remained aggressive. Linda clearly believed pressure would force me into submission. What she did not realize was that every new letter strengthened my determination. My attorney eventually prepared a formal response. Unlike the HOA's communications, our letter relied entirely on documented facts. We included copies of ownership records, survey findings, property maps, historical deeds, everything necessary to establish the truth. The final section of the letter informed the HOA that any future discussions must acknowledge my ownership of the private access road. It was professional. It was factual. And it was impossible to ignore. The letter was sent through certified mail. Then we waited. Less than 48 hours later, something interesting happened. Several residents contacted me unexpectedly. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then more people called. Then even more. Soon it became obvious that news had spread throughout the community. The HOA board had received our response. And panic was beginning to appear. One homeowner told me emergency meetings were taking place. Another mentioned heated discussions inside the clubhouse. Several residents apparently questioned why the board never investigated property ownership before starting a fight. The situation was changing quickly. For months, the HOA controlled the narrative. Now that narrative was collapsing. A few days later, I learned that the HOA had hired outside legal counsel. That decision told me everything I needed to know. If they were confident they would not need additional opinions, they were looking for answers. And probably hoping to find flaws in my documentation. Unfortunately for them, the facts remained consistent. Their attorney reviewed the records, the surveys, the deeds, the property history. Then he delivered news the board did not want to hear. The ownership records were legitimate. The access road belonged to Daniel Brooks. Word of that conclusion spread surprisingly fast. Soon residents throughout the neighborhood began discussing the issue openly. People who never paid attention to property law suddenly became very interested. Questions appeared everywhere. How did this happen? Why did nobody know? What would happen next? Was access to the community at risk? Many residents approached me directly. Some seemed worried. Others appeared curious. Most simply wanted honest information. I explained the same thing every time. I had no interest in creating problems for homeowners. My dispute was with the HOA leadership, not with families living in the community. That reassurance helped calm concerns. In fact, many residents became surprisingly supportive. The more they learned, the more they questioned the board's actions. Some wondered why the HOA spent community resources pursuing a fight that never should have started. Others questioned Linda's leadership. For the first time, cracks were beginning to appear inside the organization. But Linda refused to retreat. Despite the surveys, despite the deed, despite the attorney reviews, she continued searching for ways to challenge me. And that decision would soon create an even bigger problem. Because instead of accepting reality, the HOA prepared a new legal strategy. One that would drag the entire dispute into court. A place where opinions matter far less than evidence. And evidence was becoming my strongest ally. As summer continued, the atmosphere around the lake changed. Visitors still enjoyed the cabins. Families still fished from the docks. Children still played near the shoreline. But beneath the peaceful surface, a major legal battle was taking shape. Lawyers were preparing arguments. Documents were being organized. Witnesses were being identified. And everyone involved knew the next phase would determine the future of the conflict. One evening I stood on the dock watching the sunset reflect across the water. The scene looked peaceful. Yet I knew difficult days were approaching. The HOA was preparing its next move. And soon we would find out just how far they were willing to go. The lawsuit arrived on a Monday morning. I remember the exact moment because I was standing outside cabin 7 helping a family unload fishing gear when my phone started ringing. It was my attorney. The moment I answered, I knew something had happened. His voice was calm but serious. The HOA had officially filed legal action. For a few seconds I simply stood there looking across the lake. Part of me was surprised. Another part was not surprised at all. After everything that had happened, it seemed inevitable. Linda Harrison had invested too much pride into the conflict. Backing down would require admitting she was wrong. And people like Linda rarely do that willingly. The lawsuit itself was exactly what we expected. The HOA claimed Daniel's cabin operations created issues for the community. They questioned property use. They challenged historical agreements. They attempted to create uncertainty around ownership and access rights. But beneath all the legal language, one reality remained obvious. The HOA wanted control. Control over the cabins. Control over future development. Control over property they did not own. My attorney reviewed every page carefully. When he finished, he looked at me and smiled slightly. That smile gave me confidence. He explained that most of the HOA's claims relied on assumptions rather than evidence. Meanwhile, our side possessed something much stronger. Facts. Recorded deeds. Verified surveys. Historical records. And a clear chain of ownership stretching back decades. The legal process moved quickly. Within weeks, preliminary hearings were scheduled. Attorneys exchanged documents. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were identified. Every day seemed to bring another deadline. Another filing. Another meeting. The dispute was no longer just a neighborhood argument. It had become a full legal battle. News traveled rapidly throughout the community. Residents discussed the case everywhere. At the clubhouse. At the marina. Near the lake. Inside local restaurants. The story became impossible to ignore. Some residents supported the HOA. Others supported me. But many simply wanted the conflict resolved. They were tired of uncertainty. Tired of rumors. Tired of watching community resources disappear into legal expenses. One afternoon I stopped by a small lakeside cafe. Several homeowners happened to be sitting nearby. They recognized me immediately. At first the conversation felt awkward. Then one resident asked a simple question. Was it true that I owned the road? I told him yes. Another homeowner asked if I planned to block access. I told her absolutely not. Then a third resident asked something that surprised me. Why did the HOA start this fight in the first place? I honestly did not have a good answer. And that seemed to bother them. Because the deeper people looked into the situation, the less sense the HOA's actions appeared to make. As court dates approached, my attorney focused heavily on preparation. We reviewed every document. Every map. Every survey. Every communication from the HOA. Nothing was left to chance. One evening we spent nearly 4 hours reviewing historical property records. The amount of documentation was incredible. Boxes filled with records. Decades of ownership history. Old permits. Tax filings. Survey maps. Maintenance agreements. The more evidence we gathered, the stronger our position became. At the same time, Linda appeared increasingly determined. She attended meetings. Approved legal expenses. And continued presenting herself as confident. But according to several residents, cracks were beginning to appear behind the scenes. Board members were asking difficult questions. Legal bills continued growing. And some homeowners openly criticized the HOA's strategy. The pressure was building. Eventually, the first major hearing arrived. Walking into the courthouse felt strangely surreal. For months the conflict had dominated my life. Now it was entering a setting where facts would finally be examined objectively. The courtroom itself was quieter than I expected. Attorneys arranged files. Court staff moved efficiently. Observers filled several rows. Among them were residents from the HOA community. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. The proceedings began with opening arguments. The HOA's attorney presented their position first. He spoke confidently. He described concerns about community interests. He discussed development issues. He referenced various complaints. But something felt missing. Specific evidence. When our turn arrived, my attorney took a very different approach. He focused entirely on documentation. Property records. Ownership history. Survey results. Verified facts. There was very little emotion. Very little speculation. Just evidence. As the hearing continued, one thing became increasingly clear. The judge valued documentation. And documentation favored us. Over the following weeks, additional hearings took place. Surveyors testified. Property experts testified. Historical records were introduced. Maps were displayed. Measurements were examined. Every witness seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. The cabins belonged to Daniel Brooks. The road belonged to Daniel Brooks. The ownership records were legitimate. The legal foundations were solid. One of the most important moments occurred when a professional surveyor took the stand. He explained the process used to verify property boundaries. He described modern GPS measurements. He reviewed historical records. Then he presented his conclusion. The ownership claims were accurate. The room became noticeably quieter. Because expert testimony carries weight. Especially when supported by evidence. Another significant moment involved historical deeds. Several original documents were introduced into evidence. These records traced ownership through multiple decades. The chain remained intact. Nothing suggested the HOA possessed authority over my property. Nothing suggested ownership had changed. Nothing supported their claims. Meanwhile, residents continued following the case closely. Every hearing generated new discussions. Every development produced fresh rumors. But as facts emerged, public opinion began shifting. More homeowners started questioning the HOA's decisions. Many wondered why the board ignored opportunities to resolve the dispute earlier. Others questioned whether personal motivations played a role. Those questions created additional pressure on Linda. The confidence she displayed publicly became harder to maintain. Inside the courtroom, I noticed subtle changes. Her expressions seemed more tense. Her conversations appeared shorter. Even her body language looked different. The reality of the situation was becoming difficult to ignore. One afternoon, after a particularly important hearing, several residents approached me outside the courthouse. They wanted to talk. Not about legal strategy. Not about property law. About leadership. They expressed frustration. Many felt the HOA board had created unnecessary conflict. Some believed community resources had been wasted. Others worried about future consequences. Listening to them, I realized something important. The case was no longer only about cabins and roads. It had become a referendum on trust. People wanted accountability. And they wanted answers. As the hearings continued, my attorney remained focused. He constantly reminded me not to become distracted by emotions. Winning arguments on social media did not matter. Winning discussions in parking lots did not matter. Only evidence mattered. Only facts mattered. Only the courtroom mattered. That advice proved valuable. Because despite growing support, I knew the final decision had not yet been made. Anything could still happen. The judge continued reviewing evidence carefully. Additional documents were requested. More testimony was heard. Every detail received attention. And while that process sometimes felt slow, it also reassured me. The decision would not be rushed. It would be based on facts. Exactly as it should be. By late summer, the case approached its most important stage. Most evidence had been presented. Most testimony had been completed. The finish line was finally visible. Yet one major question remained unanswered. How would the judge rule? The answer would determine everything. The future of the cabins. The future of the road. The future of the HOA leadership. And perhaps even the future of the community itself. As I left the courthouse after one of the final hearings, I looked across the parking lot and noticed Linda standing alone. For a moment she looked nothing like the confident HOA president who started this fight. She looked tired, frustrated, and worried. Deep down I think she knew what was coming. Because when facts continue pointing in one direction for months, there comes a point where reality becomes impossible to deny. And that point was rapidly approaching. The final weeks before the ruling felt different from everything that came before. For months the case had been about gathering evidence, reviewing documents, preparing testimony, building arguments. Now there was nothing left to prepare. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had spoken. The records had been reviewed. All that remained was the decision. And that waiting period was surprisingly difficult. Every morning I woke up wondering if today would be the day. Every phone call caught my attention. Every email made me curious. The uncertainty seemed endless. Meanwhile, life around the lake continued. Guests still arrived at the cabins. Families still spent time on the docks. Boats still crossed the water. From a distance everything appeared normal. But underneath that calm surface everyone knew something important was approaching. The entire community was waiting. The residents were waiting. The HOA board was waiting. And I was waiting. Then one morning the call finally came. My attorney informed me that the court had scheduled the ruling. The date was only a few days away. For the first time since the conflict began, everything suddenly felt real. This wasn't another hearing. It wasn't another filing. It wasn't another delay. This would be the final answer. The day arrived faster than I expected. When I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I noticed more vehicles than usual. Word had spread throughout the community. People wanted to witness the outcome. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw several familiar faces. Homeowners, residents, local business owners, even a few former guests from the cabins. The dispute had become larger than any of us expected. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt unusually quiet. Conversations were brief. People spoke softly. Everyone understood the significance of the moment. I took my seat beside my attorney. Across the room, Linda sat with members of the HOA board. For the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. Not frustrated. Not angry. Nervous. Months earlier, she projected complete confidence. Now that confidence seemed gone. The judge entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. Then the room became silent. The ruling began. The judge reviewed the history of the dispute. Property ownership records were discussed. Survey findings were summarized. Legal arguments were referenced. The review was detailed and thorough. As I listened, I realized something important. Every major piece of evidence mentioned by the court supported our position. Every significant finding pointed in the same direction. The facts were impossible to ignore. Then came the words everyone had been waiting to hear. The court confirmed my ownership of the 12 lake cabins. The court confirmed my ownership of the private access road. The court rejected the HOA's primary claims. And the court recognized the validity of the historical property records and surveys. For a moment I simply sat there. Months of stress. Months of uncertainty. Months of preparation. All of it led to that moment. The truth had prevailed. I looked toward my attorney. He nodded quietly. Neither of us needed to say anything. The outcome spoke for itself. Across the courtroom, reactions varied. Some residents appeared relieved. Others seemed surprised. A few looked completely shocked. The HOA board looked defeated. Linda stared at the table in front of her. The confidence that fueled the entire conflict had disappeared. The judge continued speaking. Additional matters were addressed. Legal responsibilities were clarified. Future obligations were outlined. But the most important issue had already been decided. The property belonged to me. The road belonged to me. And the HOA had failed to prove otherwise. As people exited the courtroom, conversations immediately began. Residents discussed the decision. Reporters from a local publication interviewed several attendees. Neighbors shared opinions. Everyone seemed eager to talk about what had happened. But I wasn't interested in celebrating. I simply felt relieved. Relieved that the truth had been recognized. Relieved that the uncertainty was over. Relieved that I could finally focus on my life again. Over the following days, the consequences became increasingly visible. The HOA board faced intense criticism. Homeowners demanded explanations. Questions were raised about legal expenses. Questions were raised about leadership decisions. Questions were raised about why the conflict continued for so long. Those questions became impossible to avoid. Several board members publicly expressed frustration. Some claimed they were not fully informed. Others argued that better decisions should have been made earlier. The internal tension quickly became obvious. Then the resignation started. One board member stepped down. A few days later, another followed. Soon additional resignations appeared. The leadership structure that once seemed powerful began falling apart. Residents wanted change. And change was coming. Linda remained in her position longer than most people expected. But the pressure surrounding her continued growing. Community meetings became uncomfortable. Residents challenged decisions. Questions became more direct. Support became harder to find. Eventually, she also stepped aside. The person who started the fight was no longer leading the community. For many homeowners, that marked the true end of the conflict. A new board was eventually elected. The new leadership approached things differently. They focused on transparency. Communication improved. Relations between residents became less hostile. Most importantly, the unnecessary conflict finally ended. The atmosphere around the lake slowly returned to normal. The tension faded. The arguments disappeared. The endless rumors stopped. People moved on with their lives. And so did I. The 12 cabins continued operating successfully. Visitors returned. Reservations increased. Families created new memories. Business was stronger than ever. Ironically, the conflict that threatened everything ended up proving the strength of the property itself. One evening several months later, I stood on the dock watching the sunset. The lake was calm. The sky reflected shades of gold and orange across the water. The cabins stood quietly along the shoreline. Guests laughed in the distance. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt peaceful. As I looked across the lake, I thought about everything that happened. The legal notices. The investigations. The surveys. The hearings. The months of uncertainty. At times the situation felt overwhelming. At times it felt unfair. At times it felt impossible. But there was a lesson hidden inside the experience. A lesson I will never forget. Never underestimate the value of documentation. Never assume people understand property rights. And never allow intimidation to replace facts. The truth does not always win immediately. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires standing your ground when everyone expects you to surrender. But facts remain facts. And eventually facts matter. Looking back, I realized this story was never really about a road. It was never really about cabins. And it was never really about an HOA. It was about protecting something earned through years of hard work. It was about refusing to let others rewrite reality. And it was about perseverance. Because when you know the truth, you cannot be afraid to defend it. Today, the access road still leads into the community. Residents still drive across it every day. Visitors still pass through it on their way to the lake. Most people probably never think about the story behind that road. And that's perfectly fine. Because I don't need recognition. I don't need revenge. And I certainly don't need validation. Knowing the truth was enough. Protecting what I built was enough. And watching the lake return to peace was more than enough. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this HOA story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable HOA conflicts, property disputes, neighborhood drama, and justice served stories. And before you go, tell us this. What would you have done if an HOA tried to take your property? And as always, where are you watching from today? Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.